Before the big house, before the polished estate, before the shiny cars and the designer handbags, there was just Sarah and Michael. And honestly, that was everything. They had met in their mid-20s, two ordinary people from ordinary backgrounds who found something extraordinary in each other. Michael was a steady man, not flashy, not loud. He didn't walk into rooms demanding attention. He was the kind of man who held the door open for strangers, who remembered your coffee order, who prayed quietly before every meal. Sarah loved that about him. She loved that when the world felt too fast, Michael was always slow enough to notice her. He noticed when she was tired before she said anything. He noticed when she'd had a hard day, just from the way she took off her shoes at the door. They married young, in a small ceremony with family and close friends. No lavish reception, no exotic honeymoon, just vows. Just two people choosing each other deliberately, fully. And for a while, a beautiful, uncomplicated while, that was enough. Their early years together were not without struggle. Money was tight. There were months when they had to decide between paying one bill or another. There were evenings when dinner was rice and stew, again, and they'd sit across from each other and somehow find something to laugh about anyway. That is the kind of love people don't talk about enough. The kind that doesn't need abundance to survive. The kind that finds joy in the ordinary, in evening walks down the same road they'd walked 100 times, in whispered prayers before sleep, in the simple, sacred act of being known by another person and choosing to stay. Michael worked hard. He was consistent. And Sarah, for all her dreams, because she did have dreams, she was not a woman without ambition, she trusted him. She trusted the process. She trusted the man. She trusted them. And that trust held them together through years of building, years of believing, years of waiting for the season to change. And then it did. Michael got a new job. A significantly better paying position with a reputable company. And after careful thought, budgeting, planning, consulting, they made the decision to move. The estate they moved into was everything Sarah had admired from a distance. Manicured lawns, wide driveways, houses that spoke a certain kind of language, the language of having arrived. She stood at the gate the day they moved in and felt a swell of something she hadn't experienced before. Not just happiness, something sharper, something that felt like vindication. We made it, she thought. And she was right. They had made it, together. But the thing about arrival is this: where you arrive also determines what arrives in you. The estate was beautiful, but it was also a world unto itself, with its own unspoken rules, its own social hierarchies, its own vocabulary of worth. Sarah began meeting the other women of the estate. They were lovely, polished women, women who wore their wealth with a casual ease that Sarah had to learn, women whose husbands drove certain cars, took certain vacations, gave certain gifts, and who spoke about these things with the kind of effortless confidence that made you wonder whether you were measuring up. At first, Sarah enjoyed the company. It was nice to have neighbors, nice to belong to something, nice to be invited for afternoon tea and Saturday gatherings. She told herself she was simply expanding her circle. She didn't realize that the circle was slowly expanding her expectations. It started with comments, subtle ones, the kind that come wrapped in smiles. "Your husband still drives that car?" said with the kind of smile that suggests the question isn't really a question, it's an observation, a measurement. "Does he not plan ahead?" said by a woman whose husband had just purchased a new SUV, said lightly, almost playfully, but followed by a pause that left room for Sarah's answer, and Sarah's answer felt suddenly insufficient. "You're too fine to be managing like this, Sarah." Managing, as if what she and Michael had built together, what they had sacrificed and prayed and worked for, was merely managing, barely surviving, certainly not thriving. The words weren't loud enough to constitute an attack. They were quiet enough to feel like observation, like truth, like something she needed to take seriously. And she did. She began to take them seriously. She began to carry them home. And Sarah, who had been content, who had been genuinely happy, began slowly, without even fully noticing, to lose that contentment. The voices she had gathered outside did not stay outside. They followed her through the gate, through the front door. They sat with her at the dinner table, stood beside her in the bedroom, followed her into every room of the beautiful house she now called home. She didn't notice it happening. That is the most dangerous thing about slow erosion. You don't feel the ground shifting beneath you. You only notice much later that you are standing somewhere entirely different from where you began. Michael noticed before Sarah did. That's the thing about being in love with someone. You become an expert at their moods. You learn the difference between the silence that means peace and the silence that means something is wrong. You can read 100 things into the way someone sits across from you at dinner. And Michael, who loved Sarah with the kind of steady, unshakable devotion that never made headlines but never wavered, Michael began to notice. She was comparing. When he drove up in his car, the same car he'd driven for years, the same car that had carried them through their hardest seasons, she no longer looked at it the way she used to. She looked at it the way the women of the estate had looked at it, like it was not enough. When he came home excited about a project at work, about a plan he had for their savings, about a vacation he was quietly setting aside money for, she listened differently now. Not with the openness she used to have, with a new measuring silence. Is it enough? Does it measure up? What would the women say? The comparing became complaining, and the complaining, at first private, then less so, began to seep into the way they spoke to each other in public. At a dinner with friends, Michael made a comment about taking things slow with a new investment. Sarah cut in, sharpened her voice just slightly. "You always want to take things slow. Sometimes you have to be bold." The table went quiet for a half second. Michael smiled, a controlled smile, and the conversation moved on. But something had moved in him too. A small, painful thing had shifted. Because that was not how she used to speak to him. Not in front of people, not in that tone, not with that implication that he was not bold enough, not man enough, not enough. The correction became a pattern. And patterns, once established in a relationship, are harder to break than most people realize. Because they don't just change behavior, they change how a person sees themselves in their partner's eyes. Michael began to feel, for the first time in their marriage, that he was failing her. Not because he was, but because that is what prolonged exposure to comparison and correction does to a person. It whispers, "You are not enough. You will not be enough, no matter what you do." And a man who begins to believe that, even quietly, even without voicing it, starts to carry a weight that love was never supposed to be. There was nothing particularly unusual about that evening. No big argument had been building all day, no heated exchange over breakfast, no simmering tension that both of them had been waiting to explode. It was just an ordinary evening. Michael came home. He had had a long day, a good day actually. He had been given additional responsibility at work, which meant more income coming the following quarter. He was looking forward to telling Sarah, to seeing her eyes light up the way they used to. He set down his bag, loosened his tie, and he told her. The response was not what he expected. Sarah was tired. She had spent the afternoon with the women of the estate. There had been talk, as there always was, about husbands and plans and futures. One woman's husband had just booked a family trip abroad. Another had just been gifted a piece of land in a choice location. And the old ache had returned. The measuring, the comparing. So when Michael sat down to share his good news, what she had was not progress. What she had, filtered through the afternoon she had just had, through the months of quiet comparison, was still not enough. Words rose in her, fast and hot and thoughtless. What kind of man doesn't think about the future? She heard herself say it. And then something else, something she had not planned, something she could not have predicted would leave her mouth. I regret marrying you. The room went still. Those words, 5 words, landed like something physical, like something with weight and edge. I regret marrying you. Michael didn't shout, he didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. He just looked at her. And in that look, in the few seconds of silence before either of them moved, Sarah saw something she had not been prepared for. She saw a light go out. Not the dramatic extinguishing of a flame, something quieter than that, something more devastating. The slow dimming of something that had always been there, a warmth in his eyes that was specifically for her, a light that said, I see you, I choose you, you are my person. That light, it faltered. And in the faltering, something sacred broke. Michael stood up. He didn't slam any ink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply picked up his keys, the keys to the car the women of the estate had mocked, and he walked toward the door. He paused for just a moment, his hand on the handle, and then the door closed behind him, softly. The softness of it was the worst part. Because she had expected loudness. She had expected him to fight back, to argue, to prove her wrong. She had expected the kind of conflict that ends with both of them exhausted and apologizing and finding each other on the other side. She had not expected the door to close quietly. She had not expected quiet. So, she waited. She straightened the living room. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat with her phone, turning it over in her hands. 1 hour passed. 2. The house, which had always felt like a symbol of arrival, felt enormous now. The high ceilings felt less like luxury and more like emptiness. The silence was not peaceful. It was loud in the way only silence can be, filling every corner with the echo of what had just happened. I regret marrying you. She tried to convince herself she hadn't meant it, that it was just frustration, just words. But even as she told herself that, something deep and honest in her knew it hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from somewhere she had let grow inside her, from a garden she had been quietly watering, not with love, but with the comments and comparisons and quiet dissatisfaction she had brought home from the estate week after week. I regret marrying you. The words had been hers, and Michael had had them. Her phone rang. She picked it up on the first ring, already forming the beginning of an apology in her mind. But the voice was not Michael's. It was a stranger's voice, calm and careful in the way that professionals are trained to be calm when delivering devastation. Hello, is this Mrs. Michael? Her heart moved in her chest. There has been an accident. Your husband was hit by a vehicle. She heard the rest of the words. She knows she must have, because somehow she got to the hospital. Somehow she made it through the doors and down the corridor and into the room where the doctors were already waiting with that particular stillness on their faces. The stillness of people who already know the ending. But she cannot tell you what words exactly were said between the phone call and that corridor. They blurred. They became noise. They became the air around her, pressing in. By the time she reached him, it was already too late. Michael was gone. The man who had loved her through years of little, the man who had prayed beside her in darkness, the man who had never raised his voice, never stopped coming back, never stopped choosing her, even when she had stopped showing him that he was enough, was gone. And the last thing he had heard from her mouth, the last words she had ever given him were, "I regret marrying you." The weeks after the burial moved strangely. Time did not stop, it never does, but it changed texture. Days felt too long and too short at once. People came and went. Family, friends, neighbors from the estate who arrived with food and careful faces and the things people say when they don't know what else to say. They sat with her and then they left, and the house would be quiet again. His side of the wardrobe stayed untouched for a long time. She could not bring herself to open it, not because she feared his absence. His absence was everywhere already, in every room, in every corner of every ordinary hour. But because she feared that opening it would make the absence final in some way she was not yet ready for. So it stayed closed. The estate continued its life around her. The women still gathered, the cars were still polished, conversation still floated over hedges and across driveways about husbands and children and holiday plans. But the voices that had once felt so real, so important, so worth carrying home, sounded far away now, like they were coming from behind glass. She could see them moving, gesturing, laughing, but the sound no longer reached her the same way. She used to measure herself against those voices. Now she could not remember why. One evening, some months after the funeral, Sarah found herself moving through the bedroom, finally sorting through some of Michael's things. She opened the drawer on his bedside table. Inside, beneath his watch and a small pocket Bible, was a folded piece of paper. She opened it slowly. It was a list, written in Michael's handwriting, that careful, unhurried script she had loved since the beginning. Paris, beach house, ring upgrade for our 10th anniversary, school fees, start saving now, road trip, just the two of us. Plans. His quiet, private plans, the future he had been building toward, slowly, deliberately, without announcing it, without needing anyone's applause or recognition. The vacation he had never told her about, the anniversary surprise she would never receive, the dreams he had carried carefully in a drawer, protecting them until the right moment. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She thought about the car the women had mocked, the car Michael had driven while quietly setting money aside for them. She thought about the evening he had come home with good news, the promotion, the promise of more, and she had met it with, what kind of man doesn't think about the future? He had been thinking about it all along. She just hadn't been able to see it, not because it was invisible, but because she had borrowed someone else's eyes to look at him with. She folded the paper carefully, held it against her chest for a moment, and then placed it back in the drawer, exactly where she had found it. She didn't know why. Maybe because moving it felt like erasing him. Maybe because some part of her needed it to stay right there in his handwriting, in his drawer, as proof that he was real, that their love was real, that the man who died on an ordinary road on an ordinary evening, carrying words he never deserved to carry, that man had been planning for them all along. The drawer closed. The room was quiet. Outside, the estate hummed with its usual life, gates opening, children calling out, the distant sound of music from a neighbor's house, everything going on as it always had, as if nothing had changed. But in this room, in this house, everything had changed, and nothing ever would again. She sits there most evenings now, in the chair by the window, watching the light change over the lawns, over the wide driveways, over the beautiful, quiet estate that she once stood at the gate of and thought, we made it. She watches the other families moving through their lives, loud and alive and unaware, the way everyone is unaware until the thing happens that makes them aware. She watches them. And she thinks about rice and stew, about laughter around a small table in a smaller apartment, when the world outside had nothing she envied because she had not yet learned to envy. She thinks about evening walks down the same road, his hand in hers, warm and familiar, neither of them saying anything in particular because they didn't need to. She thinks about whispered prayers before sleep, his voice, low and certain, asking quietly for things she couldn't always hear, but somehow always felt. She would trade every square foot of this beautiful house for one of those evenings. One ordinary, unremarkable evening, before the estate, before the voices, before she began measuring a good man against other people's idea of greatness. She would trade it all. She sits there until the light is gone, until the estate settles into night, and the house around her grows dark and enormous in the way that only a house, without the right person in it, can be enormous. And somewhere in the quiet of it, in the particular heavy silence of a life that still moves forward, even when you wish it wouldn't, she is still in that room, still watching the door close softly, still hearing the quiet that swallowed everything after, still carrying 5 words she would give anything to take back. She said them in a moment. She will live with them forever. Loving this content? Please like, share, subscribe to this channel and turn on your notification. You don't want to miss what's coming next.